Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. The first time Alexander Hawley noticed her, she was sitting on the stone steps outside one of his luxury hotels in Midtown Manhattan. He had just come from a board meeting, his tailored suit still sharp despite the late hour, his driver waiting to take him home. She was different from the dozens of faces he passed every day. Dirty jacket, tangled hair, thin frame that spoke of hunger, but what caught him wasn't her appearance. It was the way she looked up at the lit windows of the hotel, as though she longed for something she could never have, and yet her eyes carried a strange kind of peace. Alexander was a billionaire by every definition, powerful, respected, feared. In some circles, married to Catherine Hawley, a woman of pedigree and elegance, he had the life that most envied: wealth, influence, a wife whose presence dazzled at every event. Yet beneath all the luxury, there was a gnawing emptiness he never admitted aloud. His marriage was more a partnership of convenience than a sanctuary. Catherine and he barely spoke beyond appearances. Their lives choreographed like a performance where passion and tenderness had long been written out of the script. That night, instead of ignoring the girl as he usually did with strangers, Alexander stopped. She startled when he offered his hand. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice low, careful not to make it sound like pity. She hesitated before nodding. Her name was Lily. She had been on the streets for nearly 2 years. After a series of tragedies, her mother's death, an abusive stepfather, and finally, the loss of the small apartment she couldn't afford on her own. As they sat in a quiet diner, she ate as though she hadn't had a real meal in days. Alexander watched, realizing with unease how long it had been since he'd seen someone so unapologetically human. What began as one meal turned into something else. He found himself drawn to her corner of the city, driving by after long days at work, searching for her. Sometimes he brought food, other times a blanket, once even a book when she admitted she used to love reading. Lily resisted him at first, suspicious of his intentions. Men with money had always wanted something, but Alexander never asked for anything. He only listened, and with every story she told him, her resilience, her quiet laughter at memories she should have hated. He felt pieces of himself shifting. The line blurred one rainy evening when he found her shivering near the train station. Instead of leaving her there, he took her to a discreet apartment he owned, far from Catherine's world, far from the eyes of those who would question why a billionaire was sheltering a homeless girl. She resisted at first, afraid of being indebted. But exhaustion won. As she fell asleep on the couch wrapped in a blanket, Alexander sat watching her, realizing he had never felt this protective over anyone. Not even his wife. Weeks turned into months, and what was meant to be kindness began to grow into something unspoken, undeniable. Lily challenged him in ways Catherine never did. She laughed at his stiffness, teased him about his polished shoes, asked him questions no one dared ask about his loneliness. Slowly, he confessed truths he had buried for years: the coldness of his marriage, the nights spent in silence with Catherine, the weight of a life built on image rather than feeling. Lily never judged him. She only listened, her presence softening. The hardened edges of his heart. The first time they touched beyond friendship happened on a night when he was unraveling. A fight with Catherine, sharp words about appearances, about his lack of passion, about how little he seemed to care for her anymore, had left him broken in a way that success and power could never fix. He came to Lily's apartment, his suit soaked from the storm, his eyes hollow. She reached for him and something broke inside him. His lips found hers, desperate, hungry, filled with years of suppressed longing. What followed was reckless and tender all at once. Alexander knew every moment with her was a betrayal of the vows he had made, a betrayal of the life he had built. Yet with Lily, for the first time, he felt like a man instead of a machine. Their bodies fit as though they had always belonged, and their whispers in the dark carried a truth that frightened him. He was falling in love with someone who had nothing but gave him everything. Their affair became their secret world. By day, Alexander played the role of the billionaire husband, attending events with Catherine, smiling for cameras. By night, he escaped to the small apartment where Lily waited for him with warmth in her eyes and a heart that asked for nothing but his presence. He bought her clothes, food, little comforts, but she never cared about the wealth, only him. That selflessness made his guilt even sharper. Catherine wasn't blind. She noticed the distance, the late nights, the strange light in his eyes that hadn't been there for years. She confronted him one evening, her voice cold but her eyes betraying a rare vulnerability. "There's someone else, isn't there?" she asked. He couldn't answer. Silence was its own confession. As the affair deepened, Alexander found himself at a crossroads. Lily deserved more than stolen nights, more than secrecy. But leaving Catherine meant scandal, division of empire, destruction of reputation. And yet, staying meant betraying the only woman who had ever taught him what love really was. One night, Lily confronted him with tears in her eyes. "You can't live in two worlds forever, Alexander. I never asked for your money. I only wanted your heart. But if your heart is still tied to her, then maybe I'm just a mistake you needed to make." He pulled her close, his voice breaking. "You are not a mistake. You're the only real thing I've ever had." Still, the choice loomed. The story of Alexander and Lily was not one of fairy tales. It was messy, painful, full of guilt and impossible decisions. Yet through it all, one truth remained. A homeless girl with nothing had given a billionaire what all his money, his wife, and his empire never could love. That was raw, honest, and unconditional. Alexander's life became a war between duty and desire, but for Lily, every passing day with him felt like a fragile miracle that could shatter at any moment. He would come to her late at night, sometimes exhausted, sometimes restless, but always with that look in his eyes, the one that made her forget the world outside their walls. In those stolen hours, she wasn't a homeless girl and he wasn't a billionaire tied to another woman. They were simply two souls who had stumbled into each other's orbit against all odds. But reality crept in like a shadow that refused to leave. Catherine grew sharper with her questions. She noticed when he lingered too long away from home. When his phone lit up with messages, he quickly turned over. When his smiles were no longer rehearsed for her, but carried a softness she hadn't seen in years. At dinner one night, Catherine stared across the table at him with a quiet fury. "I don't recognize you anymore," she said. "And maybe that's worse than anything else. You seem happy, but not with me." Alexander said nothing, only swirling the wine in his glass, as though silence could shield him from the truth. His wealth had taught him to manage crises, to control narratives, to bury scandals. But this wasn't business. This was his heart, raw and ungovernable. Meanwhile, Lily began to feel the weight of the affair in ways she hadn't expected. At first, she told herself she was grateful for the shelter, the meals, the books he brought her. But as weeks turned into months, it became more than survival, it was love. She found herself waiting at the window, straining to hear the sound of his footsteps in the hall, her chest tightening with a longing that frightened her. She wasn't afraid of poverty anymore, she was afraid of losing him. One evening, as they lay side by side in the dim glow of a lamp, Lily turned toward him. "Do you ever think about what happens if she finds out? If the world finds out?" Her voice trembled. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Every day. And still, I can't stay away from you." "But what if she makes?" "You choose." "I've already chosen, Lily. I just haven't had the courage to say it out loud." Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unbearable weight of hope. She had been abandoned so many times, and yet here was a man promising her the very thing she never thought she deserved. The first time Catherine confronted him with proof was a night that nearly destroyed them all. She had followed him something she had never done before. He entered Lily's apartment, and Catherine waited long enough to see him kiss her before storming away. When Alexander returned home later, Catherine was sitting in the dark, her face pale with a quiet kind of rage. "You've humiliated me. she whispered, her voice breaking. And for what? For someone who doesn't belong in our world. Alexander bristled. Don't you dare talk about her like that. Her laughter was bitter. So it's true. You're in love with her. The silence that followed was heavier than any confession. Catherine stood, her hands trembling. Then? You've ruined everything for me, for you, for us. I hope she's worth the empire you're about to burn. After that night, Alexander didn't return to Lily immediately. Days passed, each one heavy with the silence of his absence. Lily, convinced he had chosen Catherine after all, packed her few belongings and left the apartment. She couldn't stay in a place that reminded her of promises she feared were broken. Alexander found her 3 days later near the library steps, clutching a worn-out backpack, her face tired but defiant. His chest ached at the sight. Why did you leave? He asked, breathless. Because I can't be the reason you lose everything, she said softly. I don't want your money, Alexander. I only wanted your heart. But if your world won't let us exist, then I'd rather go back to nothing than watch you destroy yourself. He stepped closer, cupping her face. Don't you see? You're not destroying me, you're saving me. Everything I built means nothing without you in it. Words cracked something inside her, but still doubt lingered. She had lived her whole life expecting abandonment. Could she trust him to choose her when it mattered most? The decision came weeks later in the most public of ways. At a gala Catherine had insisted they attend, Alexander stood before the crowd. Every camera in the city flashing at him, and he abandoned the speech he was supposed to give. Instead, he said, For years, I've lived behind walls, pretending wealth could replace what I didn't have. But tonight, I want to stop pretending. I am in love with someone who taught me what it means to be alive again. Gasps rippled through the audience, and Catherine's face turned to stone. Alexander didn't flinch. When the night ended, his reputation was in tatters, the press waiting to devour the scandal. But for the first time in years, he felt free. He returned to Lily, who stood trembling as he approached her. You really did it, she whispered. I told you, he said, his voice steady. You were never a mistake. You are the only truth I've ever known. Their embrace that night wasn't just of love, but of two broken lives, stitching themselves into something whole. The road ahead would be brutal scandal, judgment, the collapse of everything Alexander once built, but neither cared. Because beneath the ruin was something indestructible. The love a homeless girl had taught a billionaire. The kind of love that asked for nothing and gave everything. The world was crueler than Alexander had imagined. The morning after the gala, his name was splashed across every paper, every online headline screaming betrayal and scandal. Catherine played her role perfectly, painting herself as the wounded wife, the picture of grace in tragedy. Investors pulled out of deals, board members whispered of betrayal not just of a marriage, but of a company's stability. What Alexander had built was crumbling beneath him. But when he returned to Lily's side, he realized that the world outside mattered less than the small, quiet space they carved together. She had found a tiny apartment again, this time on her own, and though it was modest, barely furnished with secondhand chairs and a mattress on the floor, it was warm with something his mansion never carried: sincerity. He sat on that floor with her, eating soup from chipped bowls, listening to her talk about the books she read, the poetry she scribbled when she couldn't sleep. And he thought, this is what I've been missing my entire life. Yet the weight of reality pressed in. People stared at them when they walked down the street. Paparazzi followed, hoping to capture the image of a billionaire fallen into disgrace, tangled with the woman who had stolen him. Lily bore it quietly, but Alexander noticed the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes searched for shadows. One night, when they returned from the grocery store, she set the bags on the counter and whispered, I don't know if I'm strong enough to live under their eyes forever. He took her face in his hands, gently tilting her chin. Until their eyes met. You've lived through worse than cameras. You've lived through hunger, nights without a roof. days without hope. You are the strongest person I know. And if you can't face them, then I'll stand in front of you until they disappear." For the first time, she broke into tears in front of him, not from sorrow, but because she had never been defended so fiercely. She buried her face into his chest, and his arms wrapped around her like a vow. But not all days were soft. Catherine wasn't finished. She launched a lawsuit for half of his fortune, claiming betrayal, humiliation, and emotional damages. It was messy, brutal, and played out across every media outlet. Alexander found himself pulled into depositions, meetings with lawyers, endless arguments with people who had once bowed to his decisions but now questioned his judgment. Through it all, Lily stayed by his side quietly, cooking him meals when he returned exhausted, massaging the tension out of his shoulders, reminding him he wasn't alone. Sometimes, though, guilt weighed on her heart. She saw what his life had been before her, all the glitter and ease, and she wondered if she had torn it apart. One night, she confessed, "Maybe she was right, Alexander. Maybe I don't belong in your world. Maybe I'm just a mistake you'll regret when the dust settles." He leaned closer, pressing his forehead to hers. "If you were a mistake, then loving you is the only one I'd choose again and again. Do you understand? I don't regret a single thing." The lawsuit dragged on for months, but in the end, Alexander gave Catherine what she wanted, half of everything. To his board, it looked like weakness. To the world, like defeat. But to Lily, it was the clearest sign that he was no longer clinging to the empire as his lifeline. "It's only money," he told her. "I can build again. What matters is I still have you." And he did build again, though not in the way people expected. He no longer cared for the giant skyscrapers or the high society gatherings. Instead, he poured his energy into smaller ventures, businesses that focused on housing projects for the homeless, literacy programs, rehabilitation centers. Lily worked alongside him, her once hidden kindness now fueling the very mission he dedicated himself to. Together, they transformed his fall from grace into something that gave grace to others. Still, whispers followed them. Former friends turned away. Invitations stopped arriving. And yet, in the quiet of their evenings, when they sat together reading, cooking, or simply lying in each other's arms, none of it seemed to matter. He often caught her looking at him with a wonder she didn't voice. And when he asked why, she would smile faintly and whisper, "Because you chose me, and I still can't believe it." Years later, when their first child was born, a daughter, with Lily's dark eyes and Alexander's quiet intensity, he held her in trembling hands and thought about the man he used to be. The man who thought love could be bought, who believed wealth was armor against emptiness. Now, with Lily resting beside him and their baby cradled in his arms, he realized he'd been stripped bare of everything, but had gained something immeasurable. Catherine, bitter and forgotten by the society that once adored her, faded into the background. The headlines moved on. The scandal became old news. What remained was the truth of two people who found each other in the unlikeliest of ways: a homeless girl who had nothing, and a billionaire who had everything but discovered he was poorer than he knew, on quiet nights when rain tapped softly. Against their windows, Alexander would pull Lily close and whisper, "You didn't just teach me what love means. You gave me life." And she would smile against his chest, knowing that though the world had judged them, what they had created together was untouchable. The years did not soften the world's memory, but they did soften Alexander's heart. Life with Lily unfolded slowly, not in grand gestures, but in small, meaningful moments that became their shared fabric. She still carried the quiet habits of her past, never wasting food, always folding and reusing old paper bags, saving buttons from worn-out clothes, things that seemed trivial to him at first, but became symbols of her resilience. When he teased her about one evening, she only smiled and said, "When you've lived with nothing, even the smallest things feel precious." He never teased her again. Their daughter grew quickly, her laughter filling the modest home they had chosen, a home far removed from Alexander's towering glass mansion. When she toddled across the floor, arms reaching for him, Alexander found himself doing things he had never imagined, crawling on hands and knees, building forts from blankets, letting her tug at his hair until he was a mess of disheveled suits, and uncontrollable laughter. Lily would watch them from the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, her eyes shining with a quiet pride. Still, not every day was gentle. There were whispers in the playgrounds when Lily dropped their daughter off, murmurs among parents who remembered the scandal. Some avoided her, some pitied her. At times, Lily would come home with that old look. In her eyes, the one she had worn back when she was invisible, walking the streets hungry and alone. Alexander would pull her close and remind her that she was no longer invisible. Not to him, not to their daughter, not to the people whose lives they were now changing with the shelters they had built and the programs they had started. But the weight of his past mistakes found ways to creep back. Catherine resurfaced once. Years later, her life diminished but her bitterness intact. She arrived unannounced at one of Alexander's charity events, her presence slicing through the air like a knife. Her words were sharp, meant to humiliate, meant to remind him of the empire she had helped him lose. Lily, standing by his side, felt her old insecurities rush back in waves. But this time, Alexander did not flinch, did not avoid. He took Lily's hand in his, held it tightly in front of everyone, and said, "I lost more than money back then. I lost time. I won't lose another moment with her." Catherine's face twisted, but she had no power left. That night, when the two of them lay in bed, Lily whispered, "I never need you to defend me like that." He kissed her hair and murmured, "I wasn't defending you. I was defending us." As the years went on, their family grew. Another child, a boy this time, with Lily's smile and a mischievous streak that drove them both to exasperation and joy. Their little home became too small, but they refused to move into something extravagant. Instead, they found a house on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and open fields, a place where their children could run free without the shadow of gossip or flashing cameras. Every evening, they sat down together for dinner, no matter how busy the day had been. Alexander insisted on it, believing that the table was where love was both spoken and shown. Sometimes the meals were elaborate, other times it was just soup and bread, but always there was laughter, conversation, and the warmth of belonging. There were challenges, of course money was no longer endless, and though Alexander rebuilt much of his fortune, he directed most of it toward causes that didn't return profit. They argued about it sometimes. Lily worried about stability, about their children's future. He worried only about wasting his second chance. Their arguments were never cruel, but there were real, heated moments where their differences clashed. And yet, every disagreement ended with reconciliation, with one finding the other in the quiet of night, whispering apologies, reminding themselves of the love that had carried them this far. In time, their children grew old enough to ask questions. Their daughter, perceptive beyond her years, once asked, "Mama, why do people sometimes look at you like they don't like you?" Lily froze, unsure how to answer. Alexander knelt beside their daughter and said softly, "Because sometimes people don't understand love. But that doesn't make it wrong. What Mama and I have, it's real. One day you'll understand." Lily's heart broke and healed all at once in that moment. She had feared that her past would scar her children, that her story would weigh on them. But Alexander turned their truth into strength, into a lesson their children could carry with pride. Decades later, when their hair had grayed and their children had grown, they still walked hand in hand. The world had long forgotten the scandal. The whispers had faded, and Alexander and Lily were left with something rare peace. On their anniversary, sitting on the porch of their quiet home, Lily leaned her head on his shoulder and murmured, "Do you ever regret it, losing all that you once had?" He kissed the crown of her head, his arm wrapped tightly around her. "I regret not finding you sooner. Everything else was just noise." The night stretched around them, calm and endless, and for the first time in a long time, Lily realized that the girl who once had nothing had somehow ended up with everything that mattered.